let's look at some basic ways to create surface textures with gesso as you're priming your surface. I typically work on wood. This is just a little piece of 1/4-inch plywood from the hardware store that I've cut down. I will build my own panels. If I'm doing a really small piece like this, I don't need to cradle it or anything like that. I probably wouldn't go any larger than this with 1/4-inch, or it will start bowing as you add paint and gesso to the surface. So we're going to do 3 different applications. I'm going to start with a rubber brayer. So I'm just going to put a little blob of the gesso on the surface here, and it goes farther than you think it will. So always better to start with not enough and add more than have too much and just be slopping it around on the surface. So it's just a rubber brayer that I have not cleaned well, but it works totally fine for this. As you can see, I obviously use it a lot for gesso because it's got gesso on the surface right now. I'm just going to spread this around using the rubber brayer. And the areas where it hasn't completely covered the surface is great because you can actually see the texture that's being created with the rubber brayer. And because this is my first layer, it's soaking into the wood really quickly, so I can actually add just a tiny bit more. My surface here. I'm going to go back and forth a few times, and what this does is it creates little tiny peaks in the surface of the gesso. You can see, that's where you can see it here. As you can see, we can see it on the surface here of the brayer. You've got just a very subtle texture. And that'll give us something akin to, I don't know, stone, like a very smoothly sanded stone. It's just a very, very subtle grainy texture. I really like painting on top of it. Now, if I were actually prepping this to paint, I would repeat that process anywhere between 3 to 10 times, depending on the exact texture that I wanted. So it's a fairly labor-intensive process, but it's more about making sure that you space out the time. So I'll often start a whole bunch of these at once. I'll go through and I'll do a layer. I'll go work on something else for an hour, let them dry, come back, do another layer, just kind of do it back and forth while I have other things on my metaphorical stove in the studio. We're going to switch this around and we're going to do this side now. And we're going to use our rubber paint shaper. And this one, now you can use this one 2 different ways. One, you can use it to create a very, very smooth surface just by spreading everything as evenly as possible, or you can use it to create sort of a plastered on stucco wall finish. And what I do to create that is, as you see, I'm changing the angle, I'm changing the pressure. I'm overall using a very, very light pressure. And I'd probably take it to about there. You can see a little bit where it's thicker, where it's thinner. It's applied fairly abstractly. I would let that dry, and then I'd repeat that 3 to 5 times, typically, with a little bit of sanding in between to make sure that the layers adhere well to each other and that they're building up in a nice way. And that one creates a very subtle, beautiful texture as well. If I know what particular area I might be painting a face or a really detailed image, I might smooth that area through sanding and careful spreading more than I would other areas and allow other areas to be more textured and abstract. So that's applying it with a rubber tool. You can also use a kitchen spatula for this. And then last of all, take the tape off here. We're going to apply the gesso with just a good old paintbrush. Now, trick here is you want something with firm but soft bristles. So you want small sized bristles with a good spring to them. So my first goal is to just get this all over and as quickly as possible, otherwise it's going to start to dry, especially this first layer, with little ridges between my paint strokes. Now, if I want to minimize the brush strokes, one, having a very fine bristled brush makes a big difference. Also, working with the grain of the wood to start off with helps get the gesso pushed down inside the grain and fairly evenly applied. Now, if I want to build up some directional texture, every single layer I would brush the same direction. But if I want as smooth of a texture as possible, what I do is for the next layer, I'd come back and I would cross hatch. And depending on the bristle of your brush and the consistency of your gesso, you can almost build up a little bit of a canvas or a woven texture this way. Because you've got the slight texture of the brush going back and forth across the entire surface. Okay, and you can also see that laid it down the thickest, the fastest. Oop. You can also use a little paint roller, like the type you'd use to paint a wall. It's going to give you a similar texture to this, but bigger. So here we have rubber brayer, a fine brush, and a rubber tool for various textures you can create on wood surfaces with gesso.